Good morning, page 523. Up to the present, we have been speaking of the positive aspects of the national character, but we cannot shut our eyes to its negative aspects, to certain touching national weaknesses, which seem to stand as exceptions and contradictions of the foregoing. The more dauntless and stern the disbelief of this atheistic people, which, for example, completely ridicules the gospel teaching which says, "Judge not, that ye be not judged," holding the judgments, in other words, sentences, don't depend on that. The more feverishly it is afflicted, nonetheless by attacks of thoughtless gullibility. Here one can draw a distinction within that closely circumscribed field of vision where the Zek can see well. He believes in nothing, but deprived of that abstract vision, deprived of historical perspective, he swallows with the innocence of a savage, any far-fetched rumor, any native miracles. An ancient example of native trustfulness was the hope he placed in Gorky's arrival on Solovki. But there isn't any need to go that far back. If you remember that is a story about the boy who told Gorky what they were doing there and begged Gorky to tell everyone, and Gorky just left him there after he was shot. It's only short. It's very sad. They don't even know his name. But there isn't any need to go that far back. There is an almost permanent and almost universal religion in the archipelago. This is faith in the so-called amnesty. It is difficult to explain just what this is. It is not the name of a goddess, as a reader might have thought. It is something akin to the second coming among Christian peoples. It is a burst of such blinding radiance that the ice of the archipelago will melt, and even the islands themselves will dissolve. All the natives will be swept on warm waves to sunny regions, where they will immediately find their nearest and most beloved. Probably, this is a somewhat transformed faith in the kingdom of heaven on earth. This faith, which has never yet been confirmed by one single real miracle, is nonetheless very much alive and persistent. And just as other peoples connect their important rituals with the winter and summer solstices, so too the Zeks mystically await, always in vain, the first days of November and May. If a south wind blows on the archipelago, they will immediately whisper from ear to ear, "There's bound to be an amnesty. It is already underway." And when the winter winds set in earnest, the Zeks warm their numbed fingers by breathing on them, rub their ears, stamp up and down, and encourage one another. That means there will be an amnesty, otherwise we'll freeze to death. Freeze to blank. Here, there is an untranslatable expression. Evidently, it's going to come now. The harmfulness of every religion has long since been demonstrated and proved, and we see the same thing here too. These beliefs in amnesty seriously weaken the natives, inducing in them an uncharacteristic state of dreaminess. And there are periods of arrests. There are periods of epidemic when necessary and urgent government work quite literally falls from the Zeks' hands, which, practically speaking, is the same effect that as that produced by the opposite kind of rumor about prisoner transports. For every construction work, it is much more advantageous for the natives not to experience any ups and downs of feeling. And the Zeks also suffer from a certain national weakness, which in some incomprehensible fashion they retain despite the whole structure of their life. This is their secret thirst for justice. Chekhov, too, observed this strange feeling on an island which, in fact, did not belong to our archipelago at all. The hard labor prisoner, no matter how profoundly depraved and unjust he himself was, loves justice above all, and if it is not to be found among the people placed over him, then year after year he fell into a state of anger, into extreme mistrust. Even though Chekhov's observations do not in any respect refer to our case, yet they astonish us with their accuracy. Beginning with the Zeks' arrival in the archipelago, every day and every hour of their life here is one of continual injustice. In this situation, they themselves commit only injustices, and one would think it had long since been time for them to grow used to it and to accept injustice as a universal norm of life. But no, not at all. Every injustice on the part of the elders in the tribe and the tribal guardians continues to wound them, and to wound them just as much as it did on their first day. But injustice which rises from the bottom to the top provokes their hearty and approving laughter. Wow. Well. And in their folklore, they do not create legends so much about justice as in an exaggeration of feeling about unjustified magnanimity. And thus it was that the myth about magnanimity to F. Kaplan was created and lasted for decades in the archipelago, alleging that she had not been shot but confined for life in various prisons, and there were even many witnesses to be found who had been with her on prisoner transports or had received books from the Butyrki library from her. And one asks why the natives needed this nonsensical myth only as an extreme case of inordinate magnanimity in which they wanted to believe. They, then, in their minds, could apply it to themselves. Instances are also known of a Zeks coming to love his work in the archipelago. A.S. Brachikov, I am proud of what I have made with my own hands, or at least not disliking it. The Zeks of German origin, but these cases are so exceptional that we are not going to offer them even as an eccentricity, let alone a universal trait of the people. And let not the already cited naive trait of secretiveness seem in contradiction with another native trait, a love of telling stories about the past. Among all backward peoples, this is a custom of the old men, and people of the Middle Age actively dislike talking about the past and are even afraid to, particularly women and particularly people filling out security questionnaires, yes, and in general everyone. In this regard, the Zeks behave like a nation. Like a nation consisting only of old men. In another respect, they have instructors. They are, on the contrary, maintained like a nation of children. You wouldn't be able to squeeze a word out of them about the petty secrets of today's life, such as where to warm up one's mess tin, or who's on Makorka or barter, but they will tell you everything about the past without concealment, disclosing everything, how they lived before the archipelago, and with whom and how they got here. For hours at a time, they listen to stories of how other Zeks got here, and they are never bored in the least by these monotonously similar stories. And The more accidental, the more superficial, the briefer the encounter between Zeks one night next to each other in transit prison, the more extended and detailed are their hurried accounts of themselves to one another. It is very interesting at this point to draw comparisons with Dostoevsky's observations. He noted that each prisoner bore silently and suffered out within himself the story of how he got into the house of the dead, and found it was not acceptable among them to talk about it. This is something we can understand. People got put in the house of the dead for crime, and those hard labor prisoners, it was hard to think back on it. The Zek gets to the archipelago by an inexplicable move of fate, or by an evil concatenation of vengeful circumstances, but in 9 cases out of 10, he doesn't feel he has committed any crime, and therefore there are no stories in the archipelago more interesting, and none which arouse livelier sympathy in the audience than those of How I Got Here. The Zeks' abundant stories about the past, which filled all the evenings in their barracks, had another purpose and meaning as well. The more uncertain a Zek's present and future, the more unshakable his past. No one can ever take his past away from the Zek, and everyone was something bigger in the past than he is now in the archipelago, since it is impossible to be lower than a Zek, and even a drunken tramp outside the archipelago is addressed as comrade. And in his recollections, therefore, the Zek's self-esteem reclaims those peaks from which life has toppled him. His recollections are, in addition, invariably embellished and invented, but extremely plausible. Episodes are inserted in them, and the Zek storyteller and his listeners feel a life-giving return of self-confidence. This self-confidence is strengthened in another way, too, by multitudinous folk tales about the cleverness and luck of the Zek people. These are rather crude stories, recalling the soldiers' legends of the times of Tsar Nicholas I, when soldiers were conscripted for 25 years. They will tell you how a certain Zek went to the chief to split wood for the kitchen, or how the chief's daughter ran out to him in the woodshed, or how a sly orderly made a crawl hole under the barracks to put a pot under the drain in the floor of the parcel room. There was sometimes vodka and parcels from outside, but there was a prohibition law at the archipelago, and with due discrimination, they were supposed to pour out all the vodka right on the ground. But they never ever did pour it out, and so this duty orderly supposedly collected it, in his pot and was always drunk. Excuse me. In general, the Zeks value and love humor, and this is the best evidence of all of the healthy psychological state of those natives who managed not to die in their first year. They proceed on the theory that tears will not justify you, nor laughter. You get into debt. Humor is their constant ally, without which, very likely, life in the archipelago would be totally impossible. They value curses too much, particularly for their humor. The funnier they are, the more convincing to them. Their every reply to a question, their every judgment about their surroundings is spiced with at least a mite of humor. Ask a Zek how much time he has spent already in the archipelago, and he will not tell you 5 years, but instead, well, I've sat through 5 Januaries. I might explain some of the humor and sarcasm in the book. For some reason, they refer to their stay at the archipelago as sitting, even though they spent the least of all their time sitting. Is it hard, you ask him? Only the first 10 years, he replies mockingly. And if you sympathize with him because he has to live such a difficult climate, he will reply, the climate's bad, but the company's good. And they will say about someone who has left the archipelago, they gave him 3, he sat out 5, and they released him ahead of time. And when prisoners begin to arrive in the archipelago, with excursion tickets for 25 years. Now you'll be looked after for the next 25 years. And in general, the Zeks talk this way about the archipelago. Who hasn't been there yet will get there, and whoever has been there won't forget it. This is a case of an unlawful generalization. You and I, dear reader, do not intend to go there at all, right? And whenever the natives hear someone ask to be given more of something, even if it is only hot water in a mug, they all immediately shout in a chorus, "The prosecutor will give you more." In general, the Zeks have an incomprehensible hostility toward the prosecutors, and it frequently bursts out. For example, in the archipelago, the unjust expression is widespread. The prosecutor is a chopper. Because its exact rhyme in Russian, we do not see any meaning in this phrase. With deep regret, we have to note here a case of the spirit of the split between associative and causative connections, which reduces the Zeks thought process below the average level common to all mankind. We will have more to say about this anon. Here are some additional examples of their cute, good-natured jokes. He sleeps and sleeps, but has no time for rest. If you don't drink your water, where will you get your strength? At the end of the workday, when the Zeks are already exhausted and waiting for knocking off time, they invariably joke about the detested work. Well, the work's just got going, but the day is too short. And in the morning, instead of setting about work, they go from place to place and say, the night should come sooner, so tomorrow we could get to work. We could go to work. And here is where we see the gaps in their logic. There is a well-known native expression, we didn't plant the forest, so we won't cut it down. But if one reasons that way, the logging camps didn't plant the forest either, yet they cut them down very successfully indeed. So what we have here is a childish, typical of the native way of thought, an idiosyncratic form of Dadaism. Dadaism. Or here again, from the time of the Billimore Canal, let the bears do the work. Dadaism. Am I the only one who doesn't know what that means? Well, how, speaking seriously, can one imagine a bear digging the Great Canal? The question of the bears working was adequately treated in the works of I.A. Krylov. If there were the slightest possibility of harnessing bears for useful work, no doubt that it would have been done in recent decades, and we would have whole bear brigades and labor camps for bears. True, the natives have a parallel expression about bears, which is highly unjust but caustic. The chief is a bear. We cannot even understand what association of ideas could give rise to such an expression. We would not like to think so ill of the natives as to combine the two expressions and draw a conclusion on that basis. Excuse me. Sorry. Going on to the question of the Zeks language, we find ourselves in somewhat of a quandary, without even mentioning the fact that each study of a newly discovered language always calls for a separate book and a special scientific course. There are specific difficulties in our case. I'm sorry, I can't talk today. One of them is in the agglomerative combination of language with cursing, to which we have already referred. No one could possibly separate them, because one cannot divide a living thing, but at the same time, We are restrained from setting down everything as it is in these scholarly pages out of concern for the morals of our young people. There's another difficulty, the necessity of precisely distinguishing the language of the Zek people from the language of the tribe of cannibals, otherwise known as the thieves, the crooks, scattered among them. The language of the tribe cannibals is a completely separate branch of the philological tree, which has nothing like it or akin to it. This subject is worthy of a separate inquiry, and we would only be confused by the incomprehensible cannibal lexicon, which, with such words as kativa, a document, marochka, handkerchief, ugol, suitcase, lukovitsa, a watch, prokoria, boots. But the problem is that there are other lexicographical elements of the cannibal language, which have been taken over by the Zek language and which have enriched it with their images. Svistet, meaning in Russian to whistle, to sing, and in the Zek language to tell a lie, to shoot the bull. Temnet, meaning in Russian to darken, to obscure, and similarly in Zek to deceive, to confuse. Raskitivat, Chermuku, meaning in Russian to cast something black over, and in Zek similarly to deceive, to throw dust in one's eyes. Kantaflatsya, meaning in Russian to be tipped over, turned upside down, and in Zek to loiter, to loaf on the job but slyly, word meaning in Russian to feel out, and in Zek to check out a location but swiftly. Filonet, meaning in Zek to be clever and loaf. Mantelet, which used to mean in Russian to lick plates at the master's table, and which now means in Zek to get stuck in, to slave away. Tzvet, meaning in Russian color, including skin color, and in Zek appertaining and belonging to the Russian thieves' law. Polizvet, meaning in Russian half-breed mulatto, and in Zek half-thief. Dukovoy, meaning in Russian pertaining to the spirit or wind, as in wind instrument, and in Zek courageous, fearless, reckless. Konde, meaning in Russian, and in Zek the cooler the punishment block. Shimon, meaning in Zek a frisk, a body search. Kostyo, meaning a crutch in Russian, and in Zek the bread ration. Fitil, meaning a wick in Russian, and in Zek a prisoner worn down and dying. Shestyorka, meaning in Russian something with 6 elements, or scoring 6 points, and in Zek something working for the camp administration, or for the thieves or trustees. Sosalovka, meaning in Russian something sucked on or which sucks, and in Zek a starvation situation. Ostritsolovka, meaning in Russian something which is a denial, a disclaimer, and in Zek a rejection of everything demanded by the camp chiefs, usually on the part of the central hardcore of thieves. Panton, meaning in Russian with the style of a card player who plays against the bank, and in Zek very much the same, bluffing, but with braggadocio. With theatrics, Gomaznista, meaning in Zek a prostitute, a camp lay. Shalashukova, derived from the Russian shalash, meaning a lean-to shelter, a shack, and meaning in Zek a shack-up, a girlfriend. Batsili, meaning in Russian Basili, and in Zek fats and oils. Heliat, pod, Zablatnuga, meaning in Zek to imitate the way of the Russian thieves. Zablatnitsia, meaning in Zek to take up the ways of the Russian thieves. Many of these words, one must admit, possess precision, vividness, even a general comprehensibility. Their crowning glory, however, is the shout Nastiest. This can be translated into Russian only by a complex description. To run or to serve something nastiest, which means on tiptoe and headlong and with heartfelt zeal and eagerness, and all of it simultaneously. I wonder if that's like Sisu. Now it seems clear to us that the contemporary Russian language is in real need of this expression, particularly because action of that kind is often encountered in life. But such concern is already in fact superfluous. The author of these lines, having completed his lengthy scientific journey through the archipelago, was extremely worried about being able to return to his teaching in the Ethnographical Institute, not merely as regards his security clearance, but also as to whether he had fallen behind contemporary Russian language, and whether the student would understand him all right. And suddenly, then and there, with astonishment and delight, he heard from the first-year students the very same expression his ears had grown used to in the archipelago, and in which the Russian language had been so deficient till now. Sekudo, meaning right away, or with a rush, or crashing on. Visu Duragu, meaning all the way, all the time. Panavoy, meaning once again. Raskurashit, meaning to rob, to clean out. Zanachit, meaning to stash, to swipe. Friar, meaning a sucker, or anyone not belonging to the thieves' law. Durak Igushi Kolodnia, meaning literally a fool with cold ears. 100% fool. Ona Praniyama Shiotsa, meaning literally she gets herself sewed up with the boys. She makes out with the boys and many others. What this indicates is a great energy of the Zek language, which helps it to filter inexplicably into our country, and first of all into the language of our young people. This offers the hope that in the future the process will accelerate, and that all the words enumerated previously will also flow into the Russian language and will perhaps even be an ornament to it. I wonder if they meant not enumerated, but elucidated. I don't know. But this makes the task of the researcher even more difficult, to separate the Russian language and the Zek language, and then to conscientiousness prevents our bypassing a fourth difficulty, some primary and sort of prehistoric influence of the Russian language itself on the Zek language, and even on the language of the cannibals, although now such an influence cannot be observed. How otherwise can it be explained that we find in Dell's dictionary anthologies to such specifically archipelago expressions, sheet Zakanom, literally to live in the law, and meaning in the Kostroma district, to live with a wife in the archipelago, to live with her in-law, Vienchit, to fish out of pocket in the Russian peddler's language, and in the archipelago they switched the prefix Zanachit to steal, Podkodit, meaning meant to become impoverished, to become fagged out, Compare Dokudit in the archipelago, to get fagged out on the point of death, to be a dying man, a last beggar. One can consider the proverbs collected by Dell as well. Cabbage soup is good people, and a whole series of violent expressions. Moral shilebok, meaning a frost person, if he is not strong. Kostur shilebok, literally a bonfire person. Shilebek is a person, Russian. And we also find in Dal, he doesn't catch mice, and the word suka, bitch, meant a spy, stuli, back in the times of P.F. Yakubovich. And then there is that remarkable expression of the natives, to dig your horns in, referring to every kind of work stubbornly executed, and in general to all stubbornness, standing up for yourself. And then to knock his horns down, or to knock his horns off, which restores to contemporary life precisely the ancient Russian and Slavonic meaning of the word horns, conceit, haughtiness, disdain, despite the phrase borrowed from and translated from the French, to put horns on, someone describing a wife's unfaithfulness, a phrase which never caught on among the ordinary people, and which even in Russian intelligentsia would have forgotten had it not been bound up with Pushkin's duel. And all these innumerable difficulties force us, for the time being, to put off the linguistic portion of our inquiry. In conclusion, a few personal lines that Zeks at first shied away from the author of this essay when he questioned them. They supposed that these inquiries were being conducted for the benefit of the Godfather, a guardian spiritually close to them, to whom, however, as to all their guardians, they are ungrateful and unjust. When they became conceived that this was not the case, and after they had been plied with Makhorka to smoke from time to time, they do not smoke expensive varieties. They adopted a kindly attitude toward the researcher, disclosing their unspoiled inner natures. In some places, they even began, in a friendly way, to nickname the researcher Dil Tomatovich, a friendly way, and in others, Fanfanich. It has to be pointed out that patronymics are not employed at all in the archipelago, and that therefore this form of respectful address bore a humorous character. Simultaneously, it expressed how inaccessible to their intellect was the meaning of this study. The author considers that the present inquiry has succeeded, and that his hypothesis has been fully proved, named that in the middle of the 20th century, a completely new nation has been discovered, unknown to anyone before, with new ethnic scope and many millions of people. Thank you for listening. For all the Russian language lovers who are still holding on, thank you for listening. Have a good day.